So this video should go over everything we covered in class, and we'll recap some of the ideas that you need to think about for the first learning outcome assessment next week. So the first thing we talked about was the ways artists can make money in the music industry, and the way of thinking about this when it comes to answering this question in the exam, or a question similar to this in the exam, would be to separate the avenues to go down into these three areas: performance, recordings, and synchronization. So the first one, performance. So if you just think of it anywhere where an artist could be playing and charging for it, so that could be live performance, it could be performance in the studio, etc., etc. So just when you're revising for this, think about that. Just try and get your head around where anywhere a musician could be playing and charging for it. Recordings. So of course there's some crossover. So artists could be playing on recordings, but what I'm talking about here more specifically is the sale of recordings. So think about the sale of CDs, the sale of MP3s, any kind of electronic distribution, as well as physical distribution, vinyl, etc., etc. So artists would make money from the sale of CDs. And synchronization, that's the big one these days. For people make quite a lot of money from that. It's where most of the money in the industry is now. So anywhere where music is synchronized or combined with another media form, there'll be PRS, royalties due. So think about video games, film, TV, adverts, etc., etc. So in the exam itself, you'll only really be asked to identify 2 or 3 ways that musicians can make money from performance or from writing. So just think about these avenues, and you should quite easily be able to identify some answers in some areas for the exam question. So the next thing you'll be required to look at, it might not come up in this order in the exam, but next thing you'll be required to think about in revising for the exam is other jobs in the industry. So this video is not going to give you complete lists and complete definitions of all this. I really want you to look through your notes and do a bit of research yourself, rather than just watching the video and expecting that to be the only piece of revision you do. And of course the exam is open book, so all I'm really doing is teaching you how to think about answering the questions in the exams and where to get information from. So just quickly go through, these are some of the other jobs you might get asked to kind of detail and identify in the industry. So promoter, now the origins of the term promoter they're kind of derived from before recorded music. So the only kind of way that music functioned as a commercial entity was in live performance, and promoters were the people involved in promoting these live performances and booking these live performances. So they'd work for venues or for promotions companies. One of the biggest promotions companies is Dance Factory Concerts in the UK, and one of the biggest global promotions companies, promoters, is Live Nation. So if you want to investigate the roles that those companies play, it would be a good way of understanding what promoter does. Now, a booking agent is slightly different. For our understanding, a booking agent is someone that will work as a kind of a middleman between promoters and artists, and will put people who are looking for performers in touch with the performers themselves for a commission. So if you do a bit of an investigation into booking agents for performance, that will give you a better understanding of that. Tour manager, it's fairly self-explanatory, someone who manages an artist or band while they're on tour, makes sure everything runs smoothly, and coordinates all information between everyone involved in the tour, between the promoters at the venues, the booking agent, the band themselves, the merch team on the night, the sound engineer, etc., etc. And they also make sure that the tour outside performance runs smoothly, so making sure that the band get fed, making sure the band have somewhere to sleep, etc. So the product manager or record label. Now this is for purposes in class, we're looking at product managers as they exist within record labels. So product manager and record label, again, similar to tour manager, it kind of coordinates all areas of the recording process. So the product manager will keep an eye on how the band are doing in the studio, keep an eye on how the media are receiving the band. They'll make sure that they've got the right producer, they're working with the right engineer, everything's everything to do with the recording and release of the artists will be in the domain of the product manager. So tour managers and product manager. A manager does essentially the same job across the board in all industries. So just adding tour or product or things in front of it just kind of identifies exactly what they're dealing with and what they're managing. A&R, remember that stands for artist and repertoire. Generally, the A&R department are scout department that look for artists and or repertoire. Remember that artist and repertoire may be two distinct entities. It could be an artist who's going to perform songs, and the repertoire could be composed by someone else. So that's very, very common in the industry, and they in our department will work in trying to combine artist with repertoire. Very often in rock music and indie music and things, artist and repertoire will be the same thing, but in chart music it's very rare that the artist and the repertoire are the same entity. So they in our department will work on trying to fit an appropriate artist with the appropriate repertoire. The British phonographic industry, we need to know a wee bit about this for the exam. They are a large industry body that represent around 90% of all record companies in the UK. They also organise the Brit Awards. So I think I'll probably leave you to do a wee bit of investigation into that. It's quite easy to investigate the BPI and the Brit Awards. So I think rather than detail all that just now, I think maybe you should do a wee bit of searching for that yourself online. And finally, this idea of major labels versus independent labels. Now the origins of this are in the difference between major labels and independent labels are that very often major labels would control production as well as distribution. Independent labels would have to subcontract out production and distribution to third-party providers. So they would have to, say, hire pressing plants in the Czech Republic, or they would have to hire distribution companies that are going to make sure that that the record is released in all territories. Whereas major labels tend to own their own, historically tend to own their own production. So they'll own a recording studio, and they'll own a pressing plant, etc. And they'll also control distribution lines so that they have access to the distribution of the music. Nowadays, some independent record labels have their own studios. Sometimes they have their own pressing plants and things. So it's a little harder to separate the differences. So I think in terms of ideology, it's easier to differentiate between in terms of ideology and economics these days. Generally, ideologically speaking, the independent record labels will be focused a bit differently. They will be profit driven, but they might not be profit driven at the expense of an underlying ideology or adherence to a genre. So maybe an independent record label will focus on new, like groundbreaking or original music, and however they conceptualize that, they'll stick to that, even at the expense of maybe losing a little bit of money. And economically, major labels have a much larger turnover than small labels. In today's economic climate, though, major labels don't actually have as much money as many independent record labels, as ironic as that might sound. They have a greater access to large bank loans and debt, but a lot of the major labels are actually going under because they don't actually have capital. They only have, they just have debt with banks. Their debt is large and their turnover is large, but profits are actually very, 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 very low, so much so that they're in debt. So in economic terms, that major labels have a lot more economic clout, and independent labels generally don't. But funnily enough, they probably at the end of the day have more money than major labels, as stupid as that sounds, but they just don't have the same access to huge loans. And so those are the main differences. I know it's a little bit complex, but if you have do a bit of a wee bit of investigation into major labels, independent record labels, you'll get a better sense of what's going on. I hope this video has been of some use to you, and I'll see you next week.